Hello, everybody. One more time in English. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. This is Chris Weave. I am here by myself today because Pat has to get up very early tomorrow morning to go fly his airplane someplace, and I think we can all agree that airline pilots should probably get a good night's sleep before they go flying. So as I'm going to do basically what I did the last time, which is, since I'm here by myself with no other guests, etc., I'm going to do a presentation for you folks. It's going to be a little bit off topic in that I'm not really going to talk about Starfleet. Instead, I'm going to talk about Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, both the book and the movie. So let me get things all set up for that. Okay, let me share the screen. And okay, I think Lissa has to share the screen now. There we go. Okay, so this is a presentation called Starship Troopers, What's All the Fuss? It's actually the first presentation that I started doing when I started doing presentations at cons, etc. And it's because Starship Troopers is just something that there's been a huge amount of controversy about it over the years. So if you haven't read the book, this presentation is riddled with spoilers. But since the book's been out since 1959, I don't actually feel bad about that. So, all right, hold on a second. There we go. So you guys all know who I am, but just a quick little summary of my background, etc. For those who are watching this on YouTube. I'm used to be on the research faculty of the Naval War College. Used to be a researcher at the Center for Naval Analysis. Then I was an intel analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. I actually didn't do those in order. I started off at the CNA before I went to the Naval War College. So I'm a naval analyst and a war game designer and a war game analyst in my day job. I've been a hobby gamer for a long time. I've been a science fiction fan for longer than that. I've been a Starship Troopers fan since I read it back in high school. I actually get cited on Starship Troopers a lot because I've got a web page that gets cited on the internet. And I'm a guy who volunteers too much, which is how I end up basically on Starfleet Tactical. So why am I here? Why am I going to talk to you about specifically Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers? Well, it's because I've got some thoughts on Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers and on Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. In fact, it was Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers that sort of led me to develop my original website, which is long in the tooth, and don't bother going to it. It needs to be fixed, and I'm going to fix it at some point. But I started responding to some stuff online when the movie was coming out about some people that just didn't understand what was going on with the book and the movie. And that sort of ended up turning into a website that's gotten some traction over the years. And this goes back almost 25 years now at this point. Wow, it's amazing to be able to say that the World Wide Web has been around for 25 years. So a few caveats, my opinions only. I already put that up once, but it's important to say again. It's not the opinion of any past, present, or future employer. It's not the opinion of Alec or Lissa or anybody else associated with Axanar. And I'm limiting this. There's actually more on my website. I've got more to say about it. This I'm kind of limited to the format to only about an hour. So this is really going to be kind of an overview. This isn't everything that I could say about this topic. So here's a brief outline of where I'm going to go. First, I'm going to look at the book. I'll give you the introduction and the background to the book. I'll talk a little bit about the plot for those who haven't read it, remind those who have, talk about the controversies associated with the book, offer what I view are some misperceptions about things in the book and what I view are my corrections of that. Like I said, my opinion only, and then give you my opinion about what this book is actually about. And then I'll go talk about the movie after I've talked about the book. And like I said before, lots of spoilers. Spoilers everywhere. More spoilers than you can imagine. So, background to the book. It was first published in 1959. It won a Hugo Award. Heinlein describes writing it, that he wrote it in a white-hot fury. He was working on something else, And the Eisenhower administration did like a treaty or a test ban or something like that drove him, that he just didn't approve of. And he basically put the thing that he was working on aside, and in a white hot fury pounded out the book in like 6 weeks, which was faster than his normal time to write a book. But he just sort of sat down and cranked it out real quick. It was originally serialized as Starship Soldier in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I think it was pretty similar to what ended up in the book version, but I haven't actually read it. I don't own a copy of that version. I'd like to go back and see it at some point. It was originally intended as a juvenile because that's what he was writing at the time, but his publisher, Scribner, rejected it because of the violence involved with it, which nowadays, if you read it, it's pretty tame. I mean, I can't imagine that the violence in Starship Troopers is any worse than is in, say, oh, I don't know, Twilight or any of those other, sort of teen books these days. But Scribner rejected it, and Heinlein basically rejected Scribner after that point. He didn't write anything more for him. He basically told him, to, screw you, I'm done with you, and he went off and started writing adult novels at that point. As of earlier today, it averages 4.6 stars on Amazon. It's got over 4,300 ratings. Keep in mind, like I said before, this is a book that came out in 1959, and it's got 4,300 plus ratings on Amazon. The last time I updated this was 5 years ago, and at that point it had like 1,800 ratings. So people are still reading this. They're still rating it on Amazon, and it generally has a pretty good reputation. It's been seen in lots of other media. There's been 3 live action movies. There's been 3 animated movies. Now, 5 of those movies total were all together in sort of one sequence. It started off with Paul Verhoeven's movie, his big budget movie, and then the rest of them were direct to video. There was one animated movie that was done by some Japanese people back in the 1980s. That animated movie was, if I remember correctly, like the first half of the movie, or maybe I'm thinking of, yeah, I think it was like the first half of it, and so it wasn't the whole thing, and they never made the second half. There's been an animated series. There's been multiple video games. There's been role-playing in various paper war games. There's been comic books. There was a make-your-own-adventure type book that came out in like the 80s or 90s, 1980s. And, it's been on many professional military reading lists. The Marines famously had it on their list for a long, long time. And over the years, it's generated lots and lots of arguments. Heinlein made the observation that it was the single book that he got the most email about, or most mail, not email, and that mostly it was negative. Now, keep in mind, this is the same guy that wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, and apparently Starship Troopers generated more mail than that did. And I have been a participant in many of those arguments. I remember I was on a mailing list back in 1997 when the movie was about to come out, and this loud person came on the list talking about what a fascist Robert Heinlein was, etc. And my responses back to that mailing list later got turned into the web page, and that later got turned into this particular presentation. So that's how we got here. So now that I've sort of gone through the introduction, let's take a look at the plot. The book opens with a Army mobile infantry member named Juan Rico participating in a raid on the planet of the Skinnies. The Skinnies are allied with a race called the Arachnids, or the Bugs, and so they're hitting the Skinny planet. We later find out that the Skinnies they're trying to prompt the Skinnies to change sides. And so this was sort of like a, if you're not with us, if you're against us, and we can bring a world of hurt down upon you, so you should change sides. After that initial chapter where you sort of see how the mobile infantry works, and he's shot out of a spaceship and lands on the planet and engages in combat, and then is retrieved from the planet. There's a flashback to his high school years and how he ends up joining the Terran Federation Mobile Infantry over the objections of his parents. He goes to a very tough boot camp, gets toughened up himself. He then goes to a combat unit, almost dies in his very first real combat operation. It's totally botched up. He then proceeds to decide that he's going to make it his career. He reconciles with his father eventually. He goes off to officer candidate school and participates in a very important operation where he does a pretty good job. And the book concludes with him as an officer running his old unit, and they're about to take the fight to the bugs on their home planet. And so, there's this implication that this is, he's going off. It's the equivalent of invading Japan. So what's controversial about any of that? Okay, let's look at the controversy. The controversy involves several issues that are often in the context of flashbacks to this class that one had in high school called History and Moral Philosophy. And the idea is that in the Terran Federation, there are certain jobs that are limited to veterans, and that veterans are the only ones that can vote. In order to be a citizen, you have to be a veteran of some sort. We'll talk about exactly what veteran means in a moment. Another controversy is that there's corporal punishment, as in public whippings for some crimes, like drunk driving is 50 lashes, and there are other crimes that are less lashes. 50 is about, I think, the most that we ever hear happening. And Heinlein makes a point in saying that it's a quick punishment. It's not a drawn out thing. It's over and it's done with. And so that's how he sort of describes it. One character is supposedly almost executed for a minor offense, and there's a reason why those words are in quotes. I'm going to argue that it wasn't that he was almost executed, and the offense was not particularly minor. And then to make matters worse, the book is really inconsistent. It says different things in different parts of the book, and I'm going to address that. His public statements about the book are inconsistent in that they do not match what he wrote. He says in some places, I wrote X when he really didn't. And these inconsistencies really fuel a lot of this controversy. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the inconsistencies are what create the space in which most of these controversies thrive. Now, that's a big chunk of it. I'd also argue that another chunk of it is that people seem to ignore the standard science fiction trope of the what if story, right? When Piers Anthony, it was either Piers Anthony or Philip Jose Farmer, I think it was Piers Anthony, wrote a book called Day World, where the idea was that people were in suspended animation for 6 days of the week, and then on one day of the week it was their day to be up and about, and that way you could have 7 times the population in an area, and you'd like share your house with people and stuff like that. And when they had the house, then it was their house, and when you had it, it's your house, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody really thought that was true, right? That's the purpose of that book isn't to make the argument that that's how we should develop suspended animation technology so that we can do that. It was a what if story, in the same way that when Gulliver's Travels, Gulliver, he wasn't making the argument that there was a place where normal humans are considered to be really small and another place where they're considered to be really big. It was just sort of a what if lens to look at society. And so that, I think, kind of gets lost in this. Okay, so let's take a look at those misperceptions and corrections. And so this is the basic list of what I'm going to go through. And I've narrowed it down. We could talk about a lot more, but I'm going to talk about whether or not the Terran Federation is a military dictatorship, what exactly is the nature of federal service, what exactly is the gender makeup of citizenship in the Federation, and then I'm going to spend some time talking about the court-martial of Ted Hendrick, because the argument is made that Ted Hendrick's court-martial shows the injustice of the entire system because his punishment was too harsh and only a loophole prevented his execution. So let's take a look at that first one, that the Terran Federation is a military dictatorship. That's the claim, that it's militaristic and that the establishment has a vested interest in starting wars because it's this military dictatorship. And this argument really makes a couple of assumptions. It assumes that the military is in charge of the government. It assumes that that government is indeed a dictatorship, and it assumes that the government and people act in a warlike manner. Now, up front, this is not a polity that shies away from combat. it's clear that they think that conflict between societies is normal. You know, these are people that probably would believe in and support the ideas that Samuel Huntington expressed in The Clash of Civilizations. They believe that there is a clash of civilizations out there, and that that's just how the world works, or in this case, the galaxy works. But the other claims are really not supported by the book, in that it's actually the case that if you're in the military, you're not allowed to hold office. Veterans are allowed to hold office. If you've completed a term of service, you are a citizen and you can vote. But if you're still in uniform, you're not even allowed to vote, which is actually much more restrictive than what we have now. And if you want to be an officer, right? So if you want to reach senior rank, you have to actually go career. So you're not going to be able to vote until you retire. There's a lot of the characters in the book are actively hostile to the idea of federal service. Like Juan's father tries to talk him out of it and sort of belittles the idea. Now, there's a little change in his attitude later on. And so you sort of get the idea that it's really sort of envy. I mean, he pretty much says that it has a lot to do with envy, but he's actively hostile to it, and there's no real hint that there's any repercussions to being actively hostile to it. There's always been limitations on the franchise. I mean, we view Athens as being sort of the epitome of democracy, but the number of voters in Athens was actually pretty small. It was limited to male landholders whose like parents had been Athenian citizens. Your family could have come to Athens from some other part of Greece 75 years previously, and you weren't a citizen because you weren't Athenian. So even now today, we have restrictions on the right to vote. You have to, in terms of citizenship, residency requirements, and you have to make your way through either naturalization or be born in the U.S. And then there's restrictions based upon whether you've got a criminal record or not. So it's perfectly natural for there to be some limitations on the franchise throughout history. There hasn't been a society that's had one. And there's no real hint that it's a dictatorship. I mean, it's consistently described as a democracy, and it's consistently described as, they're willing to fight a war if they need to, but there's nothing that indicates that they go out and they actively start wars. Now, I will point out, like I said before, this is a what-if story. The feasibility of such a system is another thing entirely. In fact, Poul Anderson talks about how he and Heinlein had a conversation about that. And Anderson's comment was, yeah, but you could never get there, right? There's no way for us to go from where we are now to where they get to. And in Heinlein's backstory, he basically had to have a world war for that to occur, and it just sort of organically grew out of the aftermath of this world war. So the one thing that's really clear, though, is while I don't think it's a dictatorship, I don't think it's particularly warlike, Mr. Dubois' comments, he's the instructor in history and moral philosophy, do imply that it's a much different political philosophy that we have. But it's also clear that many don't share it. Everybody has to take history and moral philosophy, but there are no grades. You don't have to do the reading. You can't fail it, right? You just have to sit through it. It's just something to be endured. It's like some of that corporate training that you end up having to do each year. I know that I have all the stuff where you just have to sit, you just have to crank your way through it. And so you can treat history and moral philosophy that way also, and it's pretty clear that a lot of people in the book do treat it that way. So let's talk about whether federal service equals military service or not. So the claim is that either federal service is exclusively military or that it includes a lot of non-military jobs. So you can sort of look at it either way. And the assessment is that it appears to lie somewhere in between. So Heinlein claims that 95% are civil service jobs. He said in the book of essays that he did with Jim Bain, that was Expanded Universe, I think was the name of it. He says, in Starship Troopers, it is stated flatly and more than once that 19 out of 20 veterans are not military veterans, but former members of federal civil service. Heinlein's wrong. It doesn't say that more than once. It doesn't say that once. It never even hints that that statement is true. And the evidence just doesn't support the claim. James Gifford, in an essay entitled "The Nature of Federal Service and Robert Heinlein Starship Troopers," writes that the evidence in the text of Starship Troopers is overwhelmingly in favor of the exclusive military and support interpretation of federal service. The only contrary evidence is sparse, vague, and subject to varying interpretations. He goes on to say, I believe that Heinlein's statement was for federal service to be only 5% military, and that in the haste and fury of writing it and due to the nature of the protagonist's service, the supporting statements were left out or inadvertently edited out. I think Gifford may actually be giving Heinlein the benefit of the doubt there. Heinlein kind of had a tendency to remember what he wanted to remember and to tweak his memory in some cases, I think explicitly so. So I think that Heinlein maybe he intended to put that in there. Maybe he just decided it'd be easier if he claimed that that's what he meant. But it's clearly not in there. Now, it is stated flatly and more than once that the government has to take you unless you are not able to understand the oath or you have a criminal record. It says the only way you can be permanently prevented from getting full citizenship is because you aren't allowed to sign up because you're incapable of understanding the oath. You aren't allowed to sign up because you have a criminal record. You are dishonorably discharged. You do not complete your terms of service. You quit, which you can do at any time, or you die, which there's a tendency to kind of want, which is a definite possibility. They have to keep you unless you quit or are dishonorably discharged. So Heinlein says, specifically the character of Sergeant Ho, who's the recruiting sergeant, says, but if you want to serve and I can't talk you out of it, then we have to take you because that's your constitutional right. It says that everybody, male or female, should have his born right to pay his service and assume full citizenship. But the facts are that we are getting hard pushed to find things for all the volunteers to do that aren't just glorified KP. You can't all be real military men. We don't need that many, and most of the volunteers aren't #1 soldier material anyway. We've had to think up a whole list of dirty, nasty, dangerous jobs that will at the very least make them remember for the rest of their lives that their citizenship is valuable to them because they've paid a high price for it. A term of service is either real military service, rough and dangerous even in peacetime, or at most an unreasonable facsimile thereof. But it's worth remembering that Sergeant Ho is actively trying to discourage Juan from joining. They bend over backwards to try to talk people out of joining the service because they only want people that are committed. This isn't something where they're actively recruiting. They actively are trying to not recruit people. In fact, Sergeant Ho, when he's there, sitting in front, he's missing an arm and he's missing his legs because he lost them in combat. And then later on, after Juan has signed up, he runs into Sergeant Ho, but Sergeant Ho's got 2 legs and an arm. Just, and he's not missing any limbs whatsoever. He's got prosthetics. He's got bionic limbs that look and feel to, when Juan shakes his hand, they look and feel just like their regular flesh and blood, but he purposefully doesn't, Sergeant Ho purposely doesn't wear that when he's sitting as the receptionist of the recruiting station, because they're trying to convince people to not join. So a lot of times when you hear these statements in this book about characters, where they say, we're going to come up with all these nasty, dirty jobs and, that may kill you and all this other stuff. Like he talks about, sending people off to test spacesuits on Titan. It gets mighty chilly on Titan, and sometimes the suits malfunction and people are killed. When all those statements are made, it's all, if you sort of look at the character and go, what is the character trying to accomplish in saying that? All those statements are trying to discourage people and saying all the civil service type jobs, all the things are incredibly dangerous. It's unclear whether they're really that dangerous. They do talk about a military structure for non-military tasks. He makes a comment about labor battalions, he being Sergeant Ho in this case. But once again, it's sort of unclear as to exactly what that means and what his motivation for saying that is. So let's talk about the gender disparity, whether federal citizenship is actually male-dominated. There's this claim that Federation society is male-dominated. The majority of voters are male. The majority of citizens are male, because women cannot volunteer for the MI or most other jobs described, and there are no women officers outside of the Navy, since no one can become an officer unless you're a combat veteran, and women cannot be members of combat units. Okay, this is just plain wrong. I mean, it's clear. It's crystal clear that this is just plain wrong. First of all, military service is constitutionally guaranteed. We already covered that up above. They have to take you. They have to find a job for you. If you do not quit, even if you really, really suck at it, if you do not quit, you will finish your term of service and you will be a citizen and have the right to vote. The limitations on women that are talked about, the only service, the only branch that we hear about that has this limitation is the mobile infantry. There is no discussion about other services except the Navy, and we know that there are female officers in the Navy. We know that so there has to be female ratings in the Navy, and we know that the Navy engages in combat. So we don't know whether women are allowed in any of the other branches because they don't talk about them, and one only looks at combat units to begin with. And so there's all sorts of support units. Like he talks about running into a cook on a transport that he had gone through basic with, but this guy had flunked out. By flunked out, I mean he medicaled out. He just couldn't handle it, and they tried to give him a medical discharge, and he said, "No, I'm going to serve, damn it!" And so they made him a cook on a transport. You know, I think there are women that could probably cook on a transport. So there's plenty of opportunities there. Sergeant Ho says we have to find a job for you. As far as the mobile infantry goes, I don't think it's that bad that women aren't in the mobile infantry. It's got a huge attrition rate. Juan Rico says, because it's a first-person book, Juan Rico's a narrator. Juan Rico says, the regiment had started with 2,009 men. We graduated 187. Of the others, 14 were dead, one executed and his name struck, and the rest resigned, dropped, transferred, medical discharge, etc. So, yeah, it's tough. I couldn't have gotten through that. And so that it's not surprising that there aren't women in the mobile infantry. And like I said, you don't have to accept a medical. If you say, I'm not going to accept it, I find something else for me, they'll find something else for you. There's one example that I think in there that functions as a reality check. The comment is made that the planet Iskander, one of the worlds of the Terran Federation, is 80% citizen. Do we think that that means it's 80% male? My guess is that society is probably approximately half men and half women. And so if you assume that every single man on that planet is a citizen, then at least 30% of the citizens on that planet are women. And I think that it's probably unreasonable to assume that every single man on that planet is a citizen. So Iskander is a pretty good counterexample, I think. So let's talk about Ted Hendricks' court-martial. This is kind of a sticky one that I'm going to break into two pieces. While still at boot camp, Juan is on temporary duty attached to the battalion commander's office because he's injured and so he can't go out and train. Sergeant Zim comes in sporting the signs of a developing black eye, and with him is Ted Hendrick, another one of the recruits, and two guards. Hendrick had disobeyed an order to freeze, which is to take cover and not move until release, and had refused administrative discipline, insisting on seeing the battalion commander, Captain Frankel. Zim relays the incident to Frankel, leaving out all mention of the source of the black eye, who then hands out his own administrative punishment. Hendrick protests the fairness of the punishment and says, when Frankel says to him, like, you seem to think that this is somehow unfair, tell me in your own words what happened. And he says, well, we were ordered to freeze and I hit the dirt and I found out I was on this anthill. So I got to my knees to move over a couple of feet and I was hit from behind and knocked flat, and Zim yelled at me and I bounced up and popped him one, and at this point Frankel interrupts. He rockets out of his chair and he says, you struck your company commander? And before Johnny knows it, a field court martial is convened The evidence is heard, and Hendrik is sentenced to 10 lashes and a bad conduct discharge. So my assessment of this scene is that the details are really kind of misunderstood. They're misunderstood in terms of what really was going on. They're misunderstood in terms of the implications thereof. And let's take a look at these separately. So let's take a look at Hendrik's punishment was overly harsh. So Zim and Frankel tried to handle this situation without resorting to a court-martial. Zim tries to give him administrative punishment. Frankel tries to give him administrative punishment, but Ted Hendricks just won't shut up. He forces an escalation. At any point, he could have just accepted the punishment, or he could have just said, "I'm out of here. I'm done. I'm sick of putting up with this. I quit." Because that's one of the features of this. You can quit at any time. Once you're, there is no such thing as I'm stuck in the military. At any time, you can say, "I'm pulling the handles. I'm leaving the aircraft. I'm done." Instead, in a room full of witnesses, he says that he hit his company commander. And that is considered a capital offense. It's one of the 31 crash landings that every Sunday they line them up and they list the 31 things that if you do it, you could end up hung by the neck until dead. We never hear what any of the others are. I assume there are things like treason and, cowardice in the face of the enemy and the other standard things that militaries do. But one of them is striking a superior officer. When not like when you're practicing hand-to-hand combat. In fact, Juan says, I've hit Zim before, but this is different. This is Zim gave an order and he got hit in response to it. So Captain Frankel at this point only has a couple of options. He can ignore that outburst, which if he does, it took place in front of a bunch of witnesses. It's immediately going to get out that Frankel just let it roll off, right? What does that do to good order and discipline if he just ignores it? He can let Hendrik quit at that point, which is not as bad, but almost as bad in that Hendrik committed the offense and he got away with it, which means that, what he's saying is you can commit this offense and get away with it. If you do it, if you lose control in the heat of the moment and you hit somebody, you hit a superior officer, you can always just say, I'm done. I guess I'm done. He can remand Hendrik to a regular military court for a general court-martial, or he could do what he did, which is he chose to convene a field court-martial. And it's clear from the follow-on conversation that takes place between Zim and Frankel that the reason why he chose a field court-martial is that a field court does not have the jurisdiction to do anything worse than give him lashes and kick him out of the army. They could not have done anything worse. So let's take a little bit closer look at that he only avoided the gallows because of a loophole, unquote. So let's turn this question on his head. It's a capital offense. Everyone, including Hendricks, knew it was a capital offense, yet he only got off with a bad conduct discharge and 10 lashes. Why didn't he hang from the neck until dead? Well, it's because the system is designed to prevent that outcome from occurring, and Frankel knows that. So there's no premium on executing recruits. The instructors, just like the recruits, are all citizen soldiers. They're there because they want to be there. They didn't have to be there. They don't have to enforce their leadership through terror, and they wouldn't want to enforce their leadership through terror. This is about making citizens, right? And it's clear that if Captain Frankel, Sergeant Zim, or any of the other instructors who witnessed the altercation had wanted Ted Hendrik to hang, he would have, but he didn't, because Zim and Frankel, from the very beginning, were doing everything they could to see that didn't happen. So Frankel at one point says, Frankel ends up having this conversation with Zim that Juan is listening to because he's sitting outside, and it's got very... not to mention what it does to morale, what Jim Westbrook says. Exactly. So Juan is sitting outside the room. He's got his head back on this very thin wall, and he can actually hear the conversation that's taking place between Zim and Frankel. And Frankel says, "What do you think I was afraid of from the moment I saw you come in here pointing a shiner? I did my best to brush it off with administrative punishment, and the young fool wouldn't let well enough alone. But I never thought he would be crazy enough to blurt out that he hung one on you. He's stupid. You should have eased him out of the unit weeks ago, instead of nursing him along until he got into trouble. But blurted out he did, to me, in front of witnesses, forcing me to take official notice of it. And that licked us. Hanging him at this point would have served no purpose. Frankel, met all of the criteria for maintaining good order and discipline by what he did. Giving him lashes, kicking him out of the army, making sure everybody understood it was because it was a field court-martial. The officer who presides as the court makes a special point of saying it. So it's in the record. I can only do X. And so I'm throwing the book at him to the maximum amount possible. I can only do X. And I can guarantee you that there was a manual that said that when you're presiding over a court in this situation, make sure you get that in the record so that all the witnesses hear that that's what happened. So the article against striking a superior officer, 9080, wasn't designed for the purpose of finding excuses to kill people. It was designed for the purpose of ensuring discipline in the field. Justice was adequately served by the punishment that Hendrik received, and extra vigilance on the part of the instructors, which teach those who didn't learn the lesson strongly enough. So Frankel goes on to say, this weary mess isn't all loss. Any regiment of boots needs a stern lesson in the meaning of 9080, as we both know. They haven't yet learned to think, they won't read, and they rarely listen, but they can see, and young Hendrik's misfortune may save one of his mates someday from swinging by the neck until he's dead, dead, dead. And he also talks there about how, we know that these guys are aggressive. They wouldn't make good soldiers if they weren't aggressive, and you take them out and you get them all keyed up on adrenaline and shit happens, right? But the instructors have to be there and make sure that that blow never lands, and because, you gotta be on top of them. And so he actually says, this is Zim's fault. Frankel is pretty clear about this. Zim didn't do his job. And Zim says something to the effect of, I wish I could have taken those lashes instead of Hendrik, because this was my fault. And Frankel's reaction is, you're right, it is your fault. But you'd have to get in line behind me, because I don't see any, I wouldn't want this kid to get lashes either. Zim makes a point of saying, Hendrik's problem is just that he's young and he thinks he knows everything. He's not a bad kid. He's just doesn't understand how the world works yet. So, and the other thing is that there's, everybody all the officers went through this exact same process, right? There is no, separate path for officers. You join the mobile infantry, you start off as a recruit, you become a private, you work your way through it, and at some point you go become an officer, but you've all been to boot camp. You've all been to the equivalent of Camp Curie or Camp Smith or one of the other camps that they have in this. And they've, all the way down from the lowest private to the highest general, they were all a recruit. They all understand how this works. They understand what it's like. They understand what it's like to be ridden all the time, et cetera, et cetera. And they're there to make sure that those incidents never happen. So I'm totally and completely sure that this was standard operating procedure, and they just run the standard operating procedure for when this happens. He wasn't hung because the system was designed to prevent him from being hung while maintaining the option of doing that if it's actual combat. So what do I think this book is about? I don't think it's about the military. I don't think it's about being a soldier. I don't think it's about how to set up a government. I don't think it's about, women shouldn't be in combat or they should be in combat. I don't think it's about how to punish drunk driving. I don't even think it's about why we fight, although all those things are talked about in the book. I think it's about civic virtue. I think it's about understanding that with the rights of citizenship, there come responsibilities. I think that it's about the fact that those have to be in balance, and that when they get out of balance, you run into problems. I think it's about understanding what it means to be part of a society, to be that a citizen has a responsibility to uphold that society and to make sure that society, not to support it without reservation, but to make sure that that society is what it should be and to be part of it. So that's what I take away from this book. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers. Now, this is one of the few instances where I actually, a lot of people talk about how in this time of COVID, when we're doing everything through Zoom, et cetera, that it's really difficult to just talk to a computer because they can't actually see the audience out there. I generally don't have a problem with that. I can, I'm paying enough attention to the chat that I'm seeing that you're engaged and you're posting stuff, even though I don't have my glasses on, so I can't really read it very well. And I'm not, because I don't have my face right up next to the screen. And, I don't really have the opportunity to read it because I'm busy doing the presentation. But this is one of the few places where I feel the lack of the audience, because when I'm doing this presentation live, I always put this up and I never mention the first line until people start laughing. That's an actual quote I read somewhere. Somebody described it as Melrose Place meets Triumph of the Will. I think maybe I saw that on YouTube. I can't remember, or Facebook, or not, Amazon in one of the reviews of the movie. But it's the perfect description of it. The movie came out in 1997. I was working at an internet software company, spending a lot of time on mailing lists and stuff. The subject of the movie came up, and somebody was talking about what a fascist timeline was, and it'll be just like the book, and the book is horrible, and all those different misperceptions were embodied in this one person on this mailing list. But they really sort of summarize it. Originally, the director or the writer wanted to do a movie called Bug Hunt. Ed Neumeyer and John Davison, he was the producer. They wanted to do something called Bug Hunt because they didn't think the movie rights would be available, and they discovered they were available, so they grabbed it. There's been a bunch of stuff that came out of it, including a lot of really angry Heinlein fans. So let's see. Let's talk about it as a translation of the book. It's also probably worth pointing out that I know for a fact that some of the people who made this movie were offered an opportunity to get plugged into the United States Marine Corps, because Ed Neumeyer went to this conference that some friends of mine went to. It was a professional wargaming conference, and one of my friends specifically said, "Hey, we work at the Center for Naval Analysis. We can plug you in." Never heard a word from him. So let's talk about Verhoeven's movie as a translation of the book. Somebody described it as based on the back of a book by Robert Heinlein. That's actually a pretty good understanding of exactly what happened. One of the interesting things about it, I think, is that Paul Verhoeven is actually kind of proud of the fact that he never actually read the book until after he had finished principal photography. Ed Neumeyer and John Davison claim to be fans of the book, but the director never read it because he didn't want it to contaminate his vision. The movie really has a different focus. It's about the evils of fascism vice civic duty. Well, to talk about the evils of fascism, you have to add some fascism to it, and so that's what they did. There's a lot of other differences that I personally don't think are important. Now, no powered suits. It'd be great to have the powered armor. They don't have the powered armor. And I can understand why they didn't do it. I think that Iron Man has shown that with color and with some inside the helmet views, they can get around the problem of if you just put helmets on people, everybody looks the same and you can't tell the characters apart. I think you can do that. If nothing else, put a big glass bowl and light it on the inside, like Battlestar Galactica and every other movie does. I'm amazed that the actors in those movies wearing space helmets can see to walk around because they've all got lights inside their helmet shining on their faces, shining in their eyes, specifically so the cameras can see their faces. All right, go ahead and do that. But, I don't think that's an important difference. They subtracted characters, they combined characters, they did this and that. They added women into the mobile infantry. I don't think that's big a deal. Somebody says they didn't have the budget for the powered armor. That's part of it. They had a big budget for that movie, and they actually did some test shots early on of powered armor. And if you think about how he describes the powered armor moving, Heinlein's very sparse in his descriptions, but he talks about these long, low leaps, etc. Apparently, when they sort of did some test renders of it, it kind of looked goofy. And so they decided they didn't want to have them jumping around like kangaroos the entire time. And once you sort of get rid of that, it was very easy to do the translation all the way to, we're not going to do powered armor, right? And most of the things out there we see where you do have powered armor, like the Master Chief in the Halo series, et cetera, there's only like one guy running around at a time. So I can understand their point about trying to make it all fit. But that doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me that they put women in the MI, because the book really talked about the equality of women. Women are perfectly capable of dying for their country, et cetera, et cetera. So the fact that they put women in the MI, I don't think that's a big deal. I think the differences that do matter are the philosophical one, where they replace the representative democracy with this fascist state and the political philosophy to go along with it. They have recruiting, they're actively recruiting versus discouraging. It's got all the hallmarks of a fascist state. There's really a lack of diversity in this movie, whereas in the book, Juan is Filipino, and you discover one of the characters is Israeli, and you've got some Germans in there, and you've got, they don't make a big deal of the different nationalities that are involved, but there's clearly some ethnic differences of all the people there. There's also some real serious intentional sadism, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. So there's a training accident, and then there's knife practice. So let's talk about the training accident. So Sergeant Zim starts out by asking the assembled recruits if any of them think they can beat him in a fight. And this kid from Georgia named Breckenridge says, "I reckon I can, sir." And he tries to take him. He's a big football player kind of guy. Tries to take him, ends up with his wrist badly mangled. And so as presented in the book, the injury is clearly an accident. The big recruit was sitting on the ground holding his left wrist in his right hand. He didn't say anything. Zim bent over him. "Broken? Reckon it might be, sir. I'm sorry you hurried me a little. Do you know where the dispensary is? Never mind. Jones, take Breckenridge over to the dispensary." As they left, Zim slapped him on the right shoulder and said quietly, "Let's try it again in a month or so. I'll show you what happened." Right? Clearly an accident. Zim clearly feels, bad to some degree about that, and says, "Okay, you did good. You volunteered. That's great. That's what we need from you guys. Sorry you got hurt. We'll do it again later." The same scene in Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers plays out very differently. Zim has Breckenridge pinned. In other words, the fight's over. Zim has won. And Zim deliberately breaks Breckenridge's wrist. He's got him pinned. He's got his arm lock on him. He deliberately breaks his wrist. So in the second incident, the knife practice incident, that scene takes place later in the book. It involves Ted Hendricks. Zim and the recruits are practicing with throwing knives when Ted Hendricks says, "What possible use is learning how to use throwing knives when one professor type can do so much more just by pushing a button," right? Launching a nuclear weapon. In the book, part of Zim's response goes like this. "If you wanted to teach a baby a lesson, would you cut off its head? No, you'd paddle it. There can be circumstances where it's just as foolish to hit an enemy city with an H-bomb as it would be to spank a baby with an axe. War is not violence, killing, and pure and simple. War is controlled violence for a purpose. The purpose of war is to support your government's decisions by force. The purpose is never to kill the enemy just to be killing him, but to make him do what you want him to do. Not killing, but controlled and purposeful violence. But it's not your business or mine to decide the purpose of the control. It's never a soldier's business to decide when or where or how or why he fights. That belongs to the statesmen and the generals. The statements decide why and how much. The generals take it from there and tell us where and when and how. We supply the violence. Other people, older and wiser heads, as they say, supply the control, which is as it should be." So notice the salient points of Zim's response. He says before he gives this little speech that he's surprised that the recruit doesn't know the answer to this at this stage in his training, but he doesn't discourage Ted from asking questions or thinking. He treats it as a serious and reasonable question, which deserves a comprehensive, thoughtful, and respectful response about the role of civilian control of the military and the necessity for the military to train for something less than all-out high-tech warfare. right? So it's about civilian control. It's about what it means to be a citizen. It's about understanding how all that system fits together. It's a civics lesson. Now, does this sound like a military dictatorship to anybody who's listening to this? Doesn't sound like a military dictatorship to me. To go back to that earlier point. In Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, on the other hand, Zim says, put your hand flat up against that wall, and then with a deft throw of a knife, pins the recruit's Ted Hendricks' hand in place. He just drills it right through the back of his hand. And then while Ted Hendricks is screaming in pain and terror, with the knife sticking out of the back of his hand, Zim laughs and says something to the effect of, you can't push a button if you've got if you disable his hand by throwing a knife through his hand. Okay, right? I mean, does that sound like the book? It doesn't sound like the book to me. So let's talk about it. Let's just forget that the book ever exists. Let's just talk about the movie as a movie, right? Let's assume they made Bug Hunt. Robert Heinlein's never mentioned. Is it an okay movie? Well, some people really like it. More power to you. I don't. I mean, I know that it's supposed to be satire. In fact, Paul Verhoeven was a Dutch Marine, but he hides it really well. He claims, Verhoeven is on record as saying that science fiction only is useful as satire, that it has no value in and of itself. It's only worthy of satire. And if you sort of look at what he's done with his other science fiction movies, that kind of comes through, doesn't it? There's lots of problems with the Army in this. They ignore combined arms. You know, there's just basically a bunch of infantry running around in the desert. There's no air support. There's no tanks. There's no artillery. There's nothing. They basically just run around in a big mob. At one point, they literally form a circle around a target and shoot into the middle of it. As I say, if it's the mobile infantry versus the campfire girls, my money's on the campfire girls. I found myself halfway through the movie, I started rooting for the Bugs because it was just, the mobile infantry was just so bad. The Navy's no better. You get these multi-ship pileups in orbit. You've got showboating junior officers. At one point, she does something that's incredibly dangerous and would have gotten anybody grounded that do it. And it didn't seem to be particularly consistent with a fascist society that you'd be taking risk like that because, they're likely to come down on you like a ton of bricks. The Navy's just no better. The basic science is just all whacked up. The time scales are all wrong, and you've got it's just problematic across the board. Hollywood oftentimes gets this stuff wrong. Sometimes they get it right, but they get it wrong more often than anything else. So let me conclude with what I call the big lie. Now, I've gotten some flack here for starting off with a quote from Adolf Hitler. I don't endorse Adolf Hitler. I don't equate Hitler and Paul Verhoeven. Paul Verhoeven was a young child when the Nazis occupied his homeland. Ed Neumeyer was born in 1955 in Austria. So while he did not live through the war, he remembers his family talking about the war. I have no problem with making a movie about the evils of fascism. I think that fascism is evil as well. I have absolutely no problem with that. What I have problems with is Paul Verhoeven lying about it. Paul Verhoeven did not read the book. He made changes to the script having not read the book. Yet he says that this is the philosophy of the world he described. We took that from his book, unquote, which at best is indicative that he's fallen prey to those misperceptions that I talked about earlier, that he didn't study the material well enough to understand that that's not how this works, that he didn't talk to people who understood how this works, that as a Dutch Marine, he did not understand what he was there for. That's the best I can say about Paul Verhoeven in this regard. So I agree with the aims of Paul Verhoeven and John Davison and Ed Neumeyer in making a movie about the evils of fascism. I disagree with their means. I don't think they had to shit on a great book like Starship Troopers in order to get their point across. And from what I understand, I've never been able to sort of confirm this because I've never seen it in print, but from what I understand, Virginia Heinlein basically had in the contract that she had to approve any deviations from the story. And she was in a nursing home at the time. And they proceeded to conduct a denial of service attack against an old woman in a nursing home. They were calling her several times a day, as I understand. Now, I could be wrong about that, right? So if I am wrong about that, my apologies. But from what I understand, they basically just hounded her until she said, all right, do what you want. And they made all these changes, and that's what we ended up with. So if you like this movie, hey, more power to you. This movie has absolutely nothing to do with the book. And I'm insulted the fact that they couldn't use the book, but they called it Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, right? So Heinlein was good enough for the marketing campaign, but he wasn't good enough for the story. I have a problem with that. So normally, if I was doing this at a science fiction convention and you were all in front of me, you'd now be able to ask me questions. But we can't do that because you're not actually here in front of me. And I'm going to go back and do what I always do. I'll save all the chats. And at some point over the next couple of days, I will put I'll put any answers to any questions, etc. In the comments section. So thank you very much, everybody. Lissa, do you have any final thoughts?
Two Geek Girls tomorrow, 7:45 to 8:30. And
Cool.
After this, I'm probably going to hop on Twitch and play Resident Evil 5 with my brother because his roommate is still out of town. And so he's bugging me to play with him.
That sounds like a great plan.
Well, I was going to take tonight off. He's like, hey, let's play. I'm like, well, I might as well stream it.
Yeah, you might as well stream it. So Jim Westbrook asked, did you like Starship Troopers? So have you read the book?
I've not read the book. However, I have watched the movie. And I feel like the movie kind of took on elements of like RoboCop.
Yeah.
And took that into consideration, which is fine. Again, the Japanese version was much better.
Yeah, I never saw the Japanese version.
I've not seen the Japanese version. But yeah, I feel like the movie version of Starship Troopers was like more in line with things like RoboCop for the satire portion of it. Like, yes, they did take the name of Starship Troopers, and that's something that irks me when they take the name of a property to like get the fans on board for something.
Yeah, and they literally called it Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers.
Yeah, so like,
and then
for example, Dragon Ball Z, the Dragon Ball Z movie that came out in 2009 or something like that, had that not had Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Evolution as the name for the movie, I would have been a lot more forgiving to that cheesy movie than had they not just attached that property to it. Had it been its own thing. but a lot of production companies don't have faith in these original ideas. And so they take a property name that a fair amount of people might know of and then slap it on the project and add some elements from whatever it was. And they're like, that's good enough, right? Not for the fans. And even then, but like, if you look at Starship Troopers as like, if you don't have any insight into the original book or anything like that, and just look at it as a true and proper satire, then it's a good satire movie. But if you look at it as an adaptation of something, it's horrible.
Yeah, and I am cognizant to the rejoinder. I remember hearing a story told by a friend of mine where Harlan Ellison was doing his usual thing of ranting against the fact that when he basically believed that the script writer for something, they should just automatically make it exactly like the script writer wrote it, because it's the script writer's product. And he he gets credit for writing The City on the Edge of Forever, but he never liked what they did with it because they made changes, and so he basically disowned something that it was perhaps the thing that he's best known for. Not the only thing, but it was, he always gets cited, and he thought it was horrible because Gene Roddenberry had the temerity to do that. And he was in full dudgeon and just sort of ranting on this at some con. And so this friend of mine raised his hand, and it's like, yeah, Don, what do you want? And he goes, Harlan, did you cash the check?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like,
But in this particular case, if Paul Verhoeven had said, this isn't really what Robert Heinlein did, but it's a great vehicle, so we made the changes to tell the story that we wanted to tell, I'd be totally okay with that.
And yeah, like, I get it. Like, if you're going at it with that perspective, then it can change your view of something. But it is really irksome as a fan of something when they take the property that you know and love and they turn it into this like monstrous contraption that doesn't really have anything to do with the thing you know and love.
At the very least, if you're going to change it, you better make it better.
Exactly. And see, that's like things like the Dragon Ball Z movie, the True Blood series. I read the Sookie Stackhouse books before that even became a thing. And like, I get changing things for the screen because like, obviously like Lafayette, for example, he was not supposed to survive the entire series. In the second book, he died at the very beginning of the book. But because everyone loved that actor in that role so much, they continued on with him. And so like things like that every now and then, like, it's like, okay, yeah, you can substitute a random character for this person and give the actor more of a role in other areas. But especially because like, adapting a book into like an actual television series, you're going to have more like filler moments anyway. But they totally went off the rails with it. Like after season 2, I was like, I can't watch this.
It's Lord of the Rings is a really interesting example along those lines, because on the one hand, I love the Lord of the Rings movies. I think that by and large, by Hollywood standards, they're actually reasonably consistent with the source material. But there's some things that bother me. The Scouring of the Shire, not having the Scouring of the Shire bothers me from a storytelling perspective.
Yes, because
I think it actually should have been. It could have been the 4th movie, right?
Yeah.
Because Saruman escapes. You don't know where Saruman is, and the thing is, it's an important journey for the characters, right? It's an important part of the journey because even though Frodo and Sam throw the ring in the mountain in the end, they're responsible for saving the world.
Yeah.
Very sneakily, right? but this is basically where they get to go back and do the entire death wish. I'm back to clean up the neighborhood sort of thing, and it really sort of shows what they've grown into as characters. The thing that really bothers me, though,
the payoff.
Yeah, it's the payoff, right? And they don't have any friends. It's just themselves. They got to do this themselves, and they do it. And they're very un-Hobbit-like. It's like, all right, just roll up our sleeves and we're going to do this, right? And what really bothers me, though, the one thing that bothers me the most is what they did with Merry and Pippin. In the books, Merry and Pippin are very competent young hobbits.
Oh, yeah.
Merry, if I remember correctly, is the son of the Lord. I mean, he's the son of the Duke. He's the closest thing to the heir of the ruler to the degree that the Shire has a ruler, right? He is local royalty. Mm-hmm. Pippin is no slouch either. They know exactly what they're doing. They're not young juvenile delinquents. That entire stealing the melon thing was something that had occurred in their youth and was they were just being boys sort of thing. And it gets turned into this, they're both juvenile delinquents.
Well, and they also kind of did Frodo dirty too. Because Frodo ended up as, for lack of a better term, the baby back bitch that Sam had to carry the entire time.
Yeah. There's
things Frodo was a lot more competent in the books, is my understanding.
I would agree with that. I don't think it's as noticeable as with Merry and Pippin because Frodo's got the ring and the ring is corrupting him. I understand exactly why Peter Jackson did it. Peter Jackson is pretty upfront about why he made those changes. He said, "Look, I got to have the characters grow, right?"
You've got to have the characters grow, and then on top of that, you kind of needed for the time, you needed the comic, what's the word? Comic relief.
Yeah.
When you're making a movie during the early 2000s, you needed the comic relief, and Merry and Pippin filled that role. It's
goes back farther than that. There's a reason why George Lucas added C-3PO as the comic relief.
Well, him and R2-D2, they were a pair because C-3PO was the straight man and R2 was the wacky comic relief. And
it's entirely about if you have, you're talking about, this is what if Hitler could blow up the sun, right?
Yeah.
And you've got, if you just have everybody super tense the entire time, if your movie is nothing but dramatic tension, it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting.
And so it makes sense that you're going to throw in some comic relief.
And, Peter Jackson is very upfront. He said, I wanted to have these characters grow. So if I want to have them turn into these people at the end, they have to start out as something different. And he does that with Faramir too, which you see in the extended edition. You get an idea in the extended edition what exactly the pressures that Faramir was under, right?
Yeah.
That if you read the book, he's just a good guy. He's always a good guy. He's able to sort of he does not take the ring. When he finds out what their mission is, he goes, nope, that's way more important. That ring would be really useful for Gondor. Have a great time. Good luck with the mission. We'll do what we can back here. And, there's Faramir's just, he doesn't even have that sense of well-meaning desperation that Boromir has.
Yeah.
Well, okay, that's kind of boring.
Yeah.
So I totally understand why Peter Jackson did it. And so because I understand it, because I don't have necessarily a better alternative to that. I don't like the fact that might very well be the right answer, but I think it might very well be the right answer. And I hate
Yeah.
the fact that that's the case. But, when you're transferring from book to video, they're two different media. They engage people differently.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't have a better answer. Verhoeven getting up and saying, "Oh, this is exactly what Robert Heinlein meant." Robert Heinlein, I'm surprised that Heinlein didn't strike him down from beyond the grave when Verhoeven said that, right? Because Heinlein was somebody who said there should be no draft under any circumstances whatsoever, and that if the price of not having a draft is that we lose, then that's an indication that it wasn't worth us surviving to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Does that sound like a guy who's like pro-fascism?
No, and see, that's the thing. Like, I get where they wanted to use it as a scaffold, but like, just have faith in the product that you're making.
Yeah,
I think is what it really should come down to. It's like, look, if you are making a good product, if you're making a good movie, if you're making a good series, it will speak for itself.
I agree.
And if you are not doing that, then you have messed up and you shouldn't be making it. Like, just be honest with yourself. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of things that were like amazing that didn't do well, for example. Like one of my favorite shows was The Middleman. It was like on ABC Family when that was still a thing. And it was based on a comic book and was fucking hilarious. It only got one season. But they did a good job with it. You can tell they were having fun with it. And sometimes that's all you can do, especially in corporate America when they're like, but the bottom line.
If I won the lottery, like one of the big ones, right? Mega Millions was up to a godzillion amount of money. If I won, $600 or $700 million, one of the things I would do, my all-time favorite book series, I came up with the idea eons before HBO did it with Game of Thrones, the idea of every book is a season.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just go to Hollywood and I would make it. And I would pay for it out of pocket. And after, it's the Exordium series by Sherwood Smith and Dave Trowbridge.
Mm-hmm.
After it was made, then I would go and talk to like HBO or whatever, and I'd basically say, look, if you want to show it, you commit to showing the whole thing, and if you're not interested in showing it, I'll just do it direct to video. But I wouldn't put myself in a situation where, if I could afford to do it, I wouldn't put myself in a situation where I had to, throw myself on the mercies of Hollywood and TV producers and all the rest of it.
I'm sorry, I'm trying not to make faces because my brother just sent me something that's fucking hilarious.
Well, I should let you go so that you can go play games, and I'll let everybody else go off to whatever they have planned for the rest of the evening. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll see you next week, and hopefully Pat will be on next week.
Yes, that is the hope.
That's certainly the plan. So thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Have a good night, guys.